Well, let's see. We've got a great program today. Everything you wanted to know about the Arizona Clean Elections Committee that you're afraid to ask. Tom Collins is here with us as the Executive Director of the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission. As Executive Director, he is responsible for day-to-day operations for the commission, a 5-member board that administrates and enforces Arizona's Citizens Clean Elections Act, including its education and campaign finance programs. Collins was an Assistant Attorney General for the Arizona Attorney General's Office, focused on election law, appeals, and Attorney General opinions. He clerked for Justice Scott Bales from 2005 to 2006, and the late Justice Michael Ryan, 2007 to 2010, of the Arizona Supreme Court. Mr. Collins, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for inviting me. This is pretty cool. It's not in my bio, but years and years ago, I covered state politics and state government for a newspaper that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, called the Tucson Citizen. And so the Democrats of Greater Tucson meetings at the Rose Garden were kind of a big part of where to find out what was going on back in the late 90s. And then, of course, I went to U of A for undergraduate school and law school. I think Michael was 1 year ahead of me and had just founded, his blog, which we continue to, I think everybody continues to read up in Phoenix. Maybe in some ways, certainly the blog of record, if not the news of record for Southern Arizona. So,
thank you, Tom. I appreciate that.
So it's very cool to be here. I'm actually super nervous about it, but so I wanted to do, because I'm a lawyer that works for a regulatory body, I wanted to do a really elaborate caveat here up front by way of introducing elections. This is sort of my attempt to kind of present the legal and policy history and arguments the commission has put forward in its ongoing efforts to educate the public, as well as courts and policymakers, on the history and purpose of the Clean Elections Act. And now we have newly the Voters' Right to Know Act. So that's a long way of saying that these views expressed may not reflect those of any of the commissioners and may not reflect my own personal views and judgments. Certainly shouldn't be construed to reflect how we might analyze any particular legal or policy problem, especially in the area of enforcement. With that said, as Joe said, the Clean Elections Commission is a 5-member, multi-party, and multi-county board. So we have 5 members, and we have 2 members from Pima County. One is Mark Kimball, who you all, I'm sure, have know from his longtime journalism career, and then his work with Congresswoman Gifford, Congressman Barber. And then our other Pima County representative currently is Galen Payton, who many of you also may know from his community involvement. I'm going to indulge myself to just note that one of our members also is a University High and U of A grad named Amy Chan, who is one of our Republican members, but she is currently General Counsel for Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes. So, and have served in a similar capacity for Secretary Hobbs. So we have a lot of Tucson connection to the board and the process, which I think is important. And another quick note, I think I want to say, people always ask, and this is still preparatory, but how is the Clean Elections Act funded? Prior to 2012, it was funded by a mix of voluntary tax credits and surcharges on tickets and other criminal and civil fines. After some legislative decisions in 2012, we rely almost 100% on surcharges on criminal and civil fines. So if you get a traffic ticket or a parking, that's the majority of our funding. And that funding, that surcharge was increased by the voters and the voter right to know. So I wanted to start by sort of, we really want to talk about everything you want to know or afraid to ask, maybe everything you ever want to know, but didn't want to have to hear all the answers to. But I wanted to start by talking about the Arizona Constitution, because the Clean Elections Act fits within a constitutional framework that the Arizona Constitution embodies in a way that I think is really important to acknowledge. You know, I think all of you know certainly that the Arizona Constitution was a progressive, reform-oriented constitution. You know, and it did that in several different ways. A lot of attention gets paid to the individual rights aspects of the Arizona Constitution and how those might be broader than the federal Constitution. But the other way to look at the Arizona Constitution is having expressed, if you will, majoritarian rights. That is to say, there was a concern about insiders out of control of the majority making decisions. So you see that reflected in the referendum power. You see that reflected in the ability to recall judges. That was controversial on the statehood. And you see that in the form of the gift clause, right? These are all parts of the Arizona Constitution that are designed to prevent insiders from taking advantage of their position for the benefit of, you know, other folks. And that's another way we look at that is as corruption, right? That's sort of conventionally what we talk about. We talk about quid pro quo corruption. You know, a couple of other things that they were concerned about, though, were corruption in campaigns. So there was a ban on corporate spending in candidate campaigns, you know, and that obviously has been changed in terms of its operation by Citizens United. There's still a ban on direct corporate contributions, but at the time they couldn't plan elections at all under the original text of the Arizona Constitution. You had, you know, a requirement that although, you know, that said that if an initiative referendum were passed by a majority of registered voters, it couldn't really be amended easily by the legislature. That we'll come back to that in a minute. We had a mandatory primary. That meant no caucuses, right? That's a reform measure. I know primaries today are a controversial issue, but at that time, the idea of a primary was to create a more, you know, open, transparent way to select candidates. And then finally, with respect to campaign finance, the initial Constitution directed the legislature to create a reporting for candidate committees to report their donors and their expenditures. That was right in the state constitution. The idea that, and then two other points really quickly, that provision and the provisions related to the publicity pamphlet for the referendum initiatives that were passed shortly after, those both also highlighted publicity. So the idea was in the Arizona Constitution is we're concerned about corruption, so we want to put some safeguards in, but we also want people to know what's going on. We want to provide direct information to voters about what they're voting on. We want them involved. We want them to be the ultimate deciders, and we want it to be in an informed manner. So that brings us a little bit to the Clean Elections Commission, where the dream of the 90s is still alive. And I say that because, you know, the Clean Elections Act was passed in 1998. And you saw from 1996 to 2000 in Arizona, and many of you know this, many of you were there. I had the opportunity to cover a lot of this, which was really great fun. You know, between in those years, we saw Clean Elections Act passed, the open primary law passed, or the quasi-open primary law passed, the IRC was created, the Independent Redistricting Commission was created, and the Voter Protection Act passed, right? What the there's a lot of ways to look at the Voter Protection Act, because right at the same time, we also saw our first efforts at marijuana reform, and that directly led to the VPA. We also saw Prop 301, we saw expanded Medicaid. So this is all sort of in the context of, if you look to our progressive constitutional origins, and you see some of these are constitutional amendments, some of these are statutory initiatives, but nevertheless, they fit within that framework, you know, of a more open anti-corruption idea that is baked into us as a state. I want to mention the VPA briefly because, you know, the VPA applies to the Clean Elections Act and all the acts going forward after that were passed by voters. But it's interesting because when we look at VPA as a direct response, for those of you who remember this, to the first attempt to do something to reform our marijuana law, drug laws. But another way to look at it is that the original state constitution said, that, like I said earlier, that if an initiative passed by more than 50% of registered voters, right, then it would be covered by something like the voter. Well, in 1954, the state Supreme Court had interpreted that provision quite literally to mean registered voters. So if you think about turnout at any given moment, we're talking about, even at our high points nowadays where we're getting like a 62% turnout in a general of an off year, which is like staggering, that's still not anywhere near the majority of registered voters. So in 1954, the Supreme, and if you read like some of the academic literature, Don Lecce and such on this, he said, sure, he sort of says, I don't think the folks who wrote it really intended to be that narrow. So one way to look at the VPA is as actually restoring the intent of the framers of the Arizona Constitution in the first place. So, Clean Elections does a couple of different things. And the first reason that Joe and Michael contacted me was to talk about public financing, and that is still a big part of what we do. But so how our public financing program at the state level works is you, as a candidate, choose not to take PAC money. You choose not to take large individual donors. You take a limited amount of quote unquote seed money. You have to show your grassroots support through a series of $5 qualifying checks from registered voters who are in your district or in the state if you're statewide. You turn that over to the Secretary of State's office. They check it, and then the commission essentially provides funding from there on in. First in the form of the primary election, and then upon your nomination for the general election. What does that do from our perspective? It breaks the link between dollars and political favors that gives rise to corruption and the appearance of corruption. Now, this was an incredibly popular program with candidates, and by 2006, close to 60% of candidates who ran for the legislature using the program, according to a report at the time by the Clean Elections Institute. A study showed, and I don't have citations with me, but I can send them to you if you like, that it did cause candidates to spend more time with voters, than with donors, right? It literally did. There was evidence to that effect. It increased the pool, diversified the pool of talent of folks who could run for office, because you no longer had to have that insider knowledge of the fundraising base in order to begin. And it also kind of, and as the world has changed, it allows you to operate outside of the consultant primary happens. So, there were some fairly significant changes in law between essentially 2006 and 2012, culminating in Citizens United. One of those cases was a case called Arizona Free Enterprise Club Freedoms PAC versus Bennett. And in that case, the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote determined that the funding formula for clean elections candidates was unconstitutional because it burdened the speech of opponents of those candidates. And the way it did that, in the view of the court, was that it said, well, if candidates have to file campaign finance reports. Based on the information in those reports, the Clean Elections Commission would distribute additional funds to candidates. Why do this? Why do this formula? Well, from the Clean Elections perspective, the answer was very simple. We didn't want Arizona has these wildly, and still does have these wildly different geographic areas covered by candidates. Candidates have, and you end up with situations where you might have wildly overfunded and wildly underfunded candidates. The best way, in the view of the folks who wrote the act, and I still think conceptually this is right, was to turn the financial formula on actual dollars in the race, since there was, in fact, by virtue of a report that everyone had to file, that information was available. The Supreme Court didn't see it that way, at least 5. And then the legislature at the time, this was 2012, despite the fact that, at that time, many of those legislatures had run clean, the legislature decided the right solution was to simply lop off the 2/3 of the funding that were controlled by this formula. So currently, clean candidates in Arizona are receiving 1/3 the amount of money folks who voted for the Clean Elections Act wanted them to receive. from the Clean Elections Fund. So that brings us to today, in the legislature, we had something like, we had 207 total candidates with 21 clean elections candidates, so about 10% usage. At the state level, we were up to about 30% usage because we had the corporation commissioners all ran clean, and then Superintendent Hoffman ran. But that brings us down to around overall 12% usage rate, which is, so it's been a steady decline for however over that time. I think within those numbers, there are some green shoots. We still have a small, but I think committed group of clean elections candidates in the legislature. And they're more sophisticated and in many ways than than folks who were just starting with the system when it was initially initiated in the early 2000s. Those candidates generally are committed to the values of transparency and that the act is driven by, and they all will say, publicly, that it does free them up from having to worry about their donors' reactions to their votes on given topics. I think the other thing that was really interesting, and not really covered, but really interesting, is we saw candidates who ran clean beat incumbents or presumptive incumbents in the legislature. We had some folks in competitive races, in a sense, who were able to, win office despite relying on clean elections funding. Now, if you were to ask the average political consultant, they would tell you that's not possible. It probably would maintain it's not possible, even in the face of actual evidence that it's possible. But that's sort of where the usage is, and there's a lot of different reasons why it's that way. Part of that we can, as a commission, and we've talked about how we can do a better job of explaining to candidates how this works. But there are some really significant headwinds there in terms of the overall view of the political establishment, and I use that word quite literally. I mean the sort of permanent consultant world and the institutions within which they work, and some of their attorneys. There's a real hostility to the idea of a hostility to regulation of money politics in general, and there's a bit of a hostility towards the idea of not having to go to those institutions and their representatives for funding. So that's something that's it's a hard problem. I mean, ultimately, all candidates, I think, in the clean system would like to see more money available for them, and there have been initiative efforts to do that, but they have not successfully gotten on the ballot yet. Over the course of the last, every election cycle for at least the last 4, there's been at least an initiative effort to put an increase in funding, among other things, on the ballot, and those have not been successful. I got to keep moving here. So, but the other major thing we do is voter education. I think that goes back again to this idea that's in our Constitution and initial statutes that the public needs to know who folks are and what's going on. So when we have a voter education guide that goes to every household in the state in both English and Spanish. I believe we're still the only state agency that actually delivers it in both English and Spanish without a request. We also have it available online in ASL, which we think we're the only organization, state organization in the country that provides voter information in ASL. We have it available for the visually impaired and in Navajo and Apache. We also have a debate program where we have seen widespread participation either online with our legislative debates, which are hosted by local Arizona journalists, and an Arizona PBS for our statewide and U.S. Senate debate. As far as debates go, in 2023, we'll be doing a work group on how to improve our debates, check in with folks, make sure that how we're operating works for folks, and maybe look at what aspects of that we need to change. And then in general, we work with the counties around the state, as well as other organizations to, go out and talk to folks about, voting. Our website, really, if I could tout one thing only, we have the best website for election information in Arizona. I think bar none. You can get everything from how government works and what the offices you're electing folks to, the point-by-point explanations of how, voting itself, how to get your ballot, and then, importantly these days, what the process of counting your ballot is. We even have a civics curriculum available for high school students and teachers who are interested in that we've worked. What was then ADE's civics curriculum group. City High in downtown has used our curriculum, for example. And then now we're coming online with the Voters' Right to Know Act, which obviously, as you all know, 72% of voters passed, and it essentially provides that if you spend, $50,000 on a statewide campaign or $25,000 on another campaign, you'll have to disclose the original sources of the contributions exceeding $5,000. It requires donors to have it requires you to get permission from donors before spenders can use that money for campaign media spending, and requires some additional reporting there of both PACs and other organizations. So that is and then we also, that supplements what under the Clean Elections Act, we still have jurisdiction over independent expenditure spending reports at the state and legislative level, as well as state and legislative campaign finance limits, which are set by the Clean Elections. So that is my overall overview. I think I made it on time.
Great.
Joe?
Well, Tom, tell you what, we're going to have some questions for you now. Our first question, Lillian Fox.
I have two questions, but I think they have the same answer. School boards aren't funded by Clean Election, and yet we had a candidate on our school board for many years who was getting like $43,000. The majority of it from outside of Pima County, and even more, and more of it outside of the state of Arizona. So my question is, can the state legislature get the school board's funding via Clean Election, and can they also restore the 2/3 that was lopped off if we eventually get a majority state legislature?
Yes, thank you, Lillian. Yes, I mean, the legislature could do both those things. I'm not sure on the school board issue. I think the one issue there is they would probably require some additional funding potentially, and then some adjustments on some other things. But in theory, that would make a lot of sense. And then on the second point, yes, they could. I don't know if it would require a 2/3, a 3/4, or a 1, or a simple majority at this point, depending upon the legal analysis there. But yeah, surely that could happen.
Okay. George Beverly, you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. I appreciate that presentation. It was really good. I have two quick questions. One, can you put your website in the chat or be able to deliver it? And the second thing that spiked my interest was the civics curriculum.
Yes.
Have you guys ever thought about making like a club or anything for students that like to debate? They just had a debate a couple weeks ago. And I think it would be really, really great if you can pair the kids to have that civic debate.
So I hope I got it. I think I put it in the chat. The website, it's just azcleanelections.gov. My typing might have been off. That's a really George, that's a really good idea. We are in our voter education planning for 2023, and the outline of that the commission approved last week. We talked about looking at more student club oriented, maybe some kind of a almost a young candidates type club. So that's something that we could talk about, and I, if you like, if we were able to get your contact information or whatever, I'd happy to, flesh that out some and, let you know what we're looking at.
Okay, Phil, you have a question. You want to unmute yourself?
Tom, good to see you. Shortly after I left the legislature, it was in 2011 or 2012, from some candidates, I heard that the Democratic Party was discouraging people from running clean. And I thought, that's outrageous. That can't be happening. Well, I called the Democratic Party and I confirmed it. It was true that the Democratic Party was discouraging people from running. I later heard that the Arizona Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee was squeezing people, for lack of a better term, to give some of their campaign funds to the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. And I presume that was true. I didn't confirm it. But then I heard that the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee was a big contributor to the Democratic Party. I thought, is there some connection here to try to get more funding for the Democratic Party? I was never able to really confirm all of that. But so I would like to ask you, Tom, what is your view of that? Is it happening? What's the impact?
As far as the ADLCC relationship with the candidates prior to 2018, some Republican folks filed a complaint with the commission, essentially arguing that the clean elections funds were essentially being taken or given over to the DLCC, or the AZ DLCC rather, to just sort of be spread around among candidates. We did, an investigation into that at a minimum, that didn't establish that there was what we call reason to believe that was happening. Although it did, and the act did, in fact, allow folks to use the ADLCC or the Democratic Party for services. You could buy things from the Democratic Party just like you buy things from anything else. So in other words, the investigation that we did based on the complaint, I made a recommendation to the commission that was not reason to believe a violation had occurred, and that the spending that was being done was consistent with the act insofar as the ADLCC or the ADP were essentially vendors to which money was being paid. The legislature didn't see it that way and placed on the ballot legislation called Proposition 306 in 2018. Proposition 306 passed, and that added language to the Clean Elections Act that said no candidate can pay any money from their candidate account to a party or a 501 organization. So that happened. With respect to the relationship between the ADP and or the AZDLCC and the candidates, it's been reported in the Capital Times and Yellow Sheet and other places that there are what you might call conditions that either or both of those organizations have given to candidates that would make it more difficult to work with the party if you were a clean candidate than if you were a traditional candidate. As those have been described publicly, we don't necessarily agree that those restrictions are necessary in order to protect the Arizona Democratic Party or the Arizona Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee from any sort of violation. And this does come up, when we talk to candidates. How in the long run that gets, sorted out is is a question. You know, we are always, you know, hopeful we'll be in a position to have a constructive conversation with the ADP about those kinds of policies, but it's, you know, it's not a simple proposition, because on the other hand, you know, and we recognize that we have some regulatory authority that, you know, to an extent, you know, folks who are in the business of campaign, right, the business of politics, would prefer there not to be regulation. And so to the extent that they might think that no firewall is, you know, there's no limit on what level of firewall you want to create between you and the potential of having a regulatory body involved in your affairs. You know, I mean, ultimately that's a decision that they're going to make in consultation with their attorneys. So I guess in that sense, I mean, that's probably about as direct an answer as I give you without getting into, you know, real, you know, getting beyond the established public facts.
Excellent question, Phil, and thank you for that
Yeah.
answer, Tom. It's a difficult needle to thread there. So I have a couple of questions from the chat. Carolyn Klassen asked right at the beginning of your presentation. She said that some Dem statewide candidates lost feel that they lost because they ran clean instead of their Republican opponents who ran traditional. She wonders if you have a comment as to whether or not you think that that's a reasonable presumption.
I think, well, I think that it is self-evident to me that Kathy Hoffman did not lose because she ran clean. That's not why she lost. There's no doubt in my mind that, because there's no way that Kathy Hoffman or a Democrat running for superintendent of public instruction was going to be able to raise sufficient funds privately to compete with Superintendent Horn's self-funding. So it's a wash. That's just, to me, that one's easy. Corporation Commission candidates, again, I would suggest, where would they get the funds, given that the Corporation Commission funding is more controversial than any other. I mean, more private funding to Corporation Commission candidates is more controversial than any other type of funding, and that's on the donor side. So again, you know, where is the money going to come from for that? In fact, I think, and then if you take a look at the treasurer's race, and you know, is there really any evidence of the contrary? Is there any evidence to refute the contrary proposition that it made no difference that Senator Quesada ran traditional versus clean? I would suggest that there's really not, again, much evidence that it would have made much of a difference. The other thing that candidates misunderstand, I think, and we could do a better job of explaining, but it runs into the issue we've talked about with Representative Lopez, which is clean candidates can contribute or can participate in coordinated party expenditures to the exact same extent as traditional candidates. And after 2016, when those laws were loosened to allow full campaign communication coordination between the nominee of a party and the party itself, right? That same rule applies to clean candidates. So, and the Democratic Party has done that quite successfully, particularly in the Secretary of State's race in 2018, Secretary of State's race in 2022, and the governor's race in 2022.
I don't know if I'm gonna have time to take a shower.
So my answer to that question would be, I think that's probably not right. I think that probably both parties are underutilizing clean election rather than using it at the right level, because we are now living in a world. We're going to have our fourth U.S. Senate election in 8 years, right? This in 2 years' time.
Yeah.
And then maybe we'll be on track after that, assuming nobody else ever resigns, right? But think about the amount of money that takes up. Think about the amount of money these competitive statewide races at the highest level take up. Think about your local legislative race. Think of, there may be more people moving to Arizona. There may be small donors, right? But even if you talk to political consultants like an Andy Barr, for example, who some of you may know, some of those small donor dollar lists are not really necessarily free and open to every candidate. Those are themselves now wrapped up in the overall fundraising apparatus. So, so to me, all those things say, well, there's not an infinite amount of small dollar donors out there to have every candidate who might have a shot at winning run with them. And if you take that in combination with, some of the ways that the legal landscape has changed in Arizona since 2016, I think that, my own, this is my personal view, and it's not a legal view or a policy view or an enforcement view. It's a practical view. Probably you want to evaluate where all the dollars are, where they're coming from, and probably better optimize the availability of the public financing system. And it's not, unfortunately, and not been my role to do that. And I'm certainly don't do math, but my sense is that I've not seen anyone sort of run those numbers on a variety of different races and produce it to say objectively, I bet it doesn't work in the governor's race. Starting since 2018, we haven't had a clean gubernatorial candidate in the primary or the general. Prior to that, we always did. And prior to that, Governor Napolitano became governor in part because of clean elections. Governor Brewer used clean elections as well. So, maybe at the governor's level it doesn't, but there are all these other different levels, especially state legislative races, where it's just not at all clear to me that private funding of candidates is dominant. Let's step back a second and look at the competitive legislative races that are coming up. There'll be probably one in Tucson. There will be, probably 2 or 3 in the Phoenix area. The drivers of those elections probably are not going to be. They might be the DLCC. They might be, but they might also be IEs. But what they're not going to be is private donations to individual candidates. It's either going to be money into the party that gets spent in coordination with the candidate under the law, or it's going to be money through independent expenditures. And so at that point, you start to wonder, and I'm saying assume assuming that you're going to always have a traditional candidate, even in those competitive, hyper competitive, flip the legislature type seats, right? I don't think, as a practical matter, the money to win is going to come from those private donations. It's going to come from money the party can raise from a variety of sources, and IEs who can raise money from a variety of sources.
Excellent observations, Tom. Thank you for that. I have a couple more questions in chat, but I want to get to Paul Stapleton Smith's question before that. Paul, you want to unmute and ask your question?
If I may, Michael Bryan and DGT, thank you for having Director Collins here. This is just so perfect and timely for our work. So you hit on this, and Phil Lopes, of course, introduced it. And if I may, as we recruit candidates, especially in red districts, right, legislative districts, the myths, as we recruit these candidates, what are the myths, Tom, that you want us to dispel for those candidates? For example, we're all Democrats. The party can absolutely help these candidates. Where is the firewalls so that we can continue to promote clean elections, because we love the work that you do. So help me there so that we don't get these candidates, God bless them for running, that freak out because they're told, the party can't help you and you can't get van access. And help me understand that. Help us understand that, please.
Well, so a couple of different things there. Generally speaking, and I have to, I should be able to do this, but I can't. But there's the provision of Title 16 that has the party nominee coordinated communications provision. It's there, and I can send you that. We have a specific rule in case there was doubt about whether that would apply to the clean elections candidates. We have a specific rule that says so. So we basically put at that statute and said if there was any doubt. And then on top of that, we sued to stop that particular provision. We joined, I shouldn't say we initially sued. We joined in a lawsuit to stop that particular expansion of the coordinated party communications, and we lost. So legislature passed a law. We had some doubts about whether or not it applied. We were involved in a lawsuit that said it absolutely does, and now we have a rule that says it absolutely does. So that's one thing. The van is a particular problem, and I don't pretend. And I use when what became Prop 306 was going through. I tried to learn as much as I could about understanding how the van access works with the legislature, with the party. I guess I don't understand. I've never understood, and it's maybe too internal for me to know sort of off the top of my head how that would work, or how you could, what a transaction would have to look like. The reason why the party doesn't give van access, at least as far as I know, the reason why the party doesn't give van access to candidates who are running clean is because they want money for it. If it wasn't a financial transaction, maybe it would be a different situation, but they want cash up front from the candidate, and Prop 306 says cash up front from the candidate cannot go to two specific types of organizations, the party and a 501. So as long as the party says you must give us cash from your candidate account for van access, I'm not saying that I'm not I don't want to speculate on what other ways there are to do this. I'm just saying, but so long as the law says this transaction is illegal and the party says this transaction is the only acceptable transaction for us, there's not a discussion. But whether or not the van would necessarily be off limits otherwise, what we would need in the process, we need to address that specific problem is there's an administrative process that would allow us to answer that question in a formal way. If someone put together the facts to do it, like you do with the FEC, you can basically ask for a kind of advisory on that, which would be one way. I think the other myth-ish thing we get is you can't, you're not gonna have enough money to keep up with your opponent. And again, the reality is that's not the right analysis, because that analysis takes you out of the question of what's your capacity in the first place, right? We lifted the campaign limits in the state from a pretty reasonable level, I thought, of a couple $1,000 to 5,000 every 2 years, which for over a 4-year term is 10,000, a person. That's a lot of money, but there really is, and I think that the Arizona Advocacy Network, before it disassembled, went and did a study on this. There's not a heck of a lot of people giving at that $5,000 limit, $10,000 limit, and in fact, most of the donations are still well below that. So again, it's sort of like, from my perspective, just analytically, what I would suggest is you really got to look at what's your literal capacity for fundraising. How much time do you want to devote on that? Because the one, obviously time is one of those things that's, once it's gone, right? So if you look at the models that the Tempe representatives who have Representative Salman and Senator Mendez have now used to successfully, they've been in contested primaries, they've had IEs in contested primaries. They've gone through redistricting that made their district less democratic, and they have managed to continue to get reelected. I think Lisa Sun in Phoenix, who defeated an incumbent. This is an unheard of thing, right? In a Democratic primary, her sort of approach. There are approaches that work, but that say, hey, here, I know how much money I'm going to get, and so therefore I know what I really have a real sense of what the time value of my is freed up now, right? But if you just set someone down a road that says you got to raise more money, you got to raise more money, you got to raise more money, you have so locked yourself into a certain time value that your options are maybe not as robust as they could be. I don't know. I mean, part of it is the amount of work they want to do, but what do you want to work at? You want to work at talking to people, or you want to work at talking to donors? I think the other aspect of this that matters, and I apologize for going on so long at this, is that, I mean, one way to look at consultants, right? What is the consultant's business? Is the consultant's business to win elections? Or is the consultant's business to deliver candidates to donors who they can raise money via, right? The consultant is not the party. The party theoretically wants to win elections, but that's not the consultant's job. The consultant's job is to make money, and the consultant is selling the candidate. And so if the candidate wants to be a product for a consultant, I mean, that's sort of a paradigm, you know, that sort of you have to be able to address if you want to break open how sealed off the information supply, right? Because if the first thing I go when I do is I want to run for office, and my friend who's been involved in politics, maybe tangentially, says, "Hey, I got this buddy who runs campaigns, you should talk to him," right? A little bit like walking onto a car lot and asking, "I'm not sure if I need a new car." Well,
Of course.
clearly you wouldn't be here if you didn't. So,
Okay, any other questions in the chat room?
Rod Norrish asks, what can be done to increase the use of clean elections funding by candidates? And I think, you can add to that, within the constraints that have been put on the clean elections program since 2010.
what more can they do to maybe I misunderstood the question.
Basically, he wants to know what can be done to increase the number of candidates that are using the clean election program. And there's also a question about, how to replace some of that 2/3 of the funding that, has been cut over the last decade.
Right. Yeah. So, it's a difficult question. I mean, the reality is that it would be political action. I mean, the Arizona Democracy Resource Center, sponsored a very bill or initiative rather, that would have rolled back some of the anti-voting changes that the legislature made, or the changes that made that were based, some more what they would call, the legislature would call electoral integrity measures in place, would have rolled some of those back and also increased the candidate funding, and also changed the way in which the formula operated. I mean, Tucson's very successful and ongoing, public financing program, operates on a little bit different premise, and as a sort of more of a match on donations at a certain level. That is more the model that is, if you look in New York City, if you look at Seattle, if you look at the municipal level where public financing really is more robust than it is at the state level in Arizona, they have a different model than that. The other states where it's still robust at the state level and do a model similar to ours are Connecticut and Maine. And I wonder sometimes, I mean, the interesting thing about Connecticut and Maine is obviously the politics there are different, and the states are different. And once you get on a state level, it's just the nature of each state and the relative viewpoint of the state legislature on these kinds of issues is going to really differ. I think that overall, if you wanted to do something that was, I'm not a policy expert, I'm just a lawyer, so I don't pretend to be able to evaluate policy on any basis other than what I read. But I do think that if you talk to the folks, the Campaign Legal Center and stuff like that the model that they're looking at is much more oriented around small dollar match than on this sort of block grant approach. Or in Seattle, the voucher, the democracy.
So shifting that model from a block grant to more of a campaign donation match, or maybe even like I've heard things like Democracy Box, where you give people, a voucher basically to make small dollar donations, might be a more viable model moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they're doing in Seattle. And I think that, it's, and what the ADRCC proposed was a kind of quasi, it's kind of both, like, so you get the initial tranche sort of money, and then the match would be off of a kind of a voucher on an ongoing basis up to a cap.
Okay, Mike, anything else?
Yeah, there was a quick question about being able to remove the voter manual from the Secretary of State. I'm not sure if he means the voter manual or the
Yeah.
the elections manual. So
I mean, that's a good question. I will say, the commission hasn't taken a position on that at the legislature. I think that surely you would want. I mean, the origin of the manual and the idea behind the manual was you were going to have essentially subject matter experts at the Secretary of State's office and the county recorder put together, the basics for consistency across across the state for just a rudimentary how do you run an election. I think that obviously as all things in elections and especially these sort of logistical issues have become more polarized. There's some push and pull there now on what should be and what should be out. You saw that most dramatically with, former Attorney General Brnovich, Secretary Hobbs' office litigating over the EPM itself. I think that what you ultimately probably want to have is an EPM process that's open and transparent. Maybe you want to find a way, and this does not require legislation, to make it a little, to simplify it a little bit. Maybe to the extent that you can get it back down to a level of maybe not. I don't know. I'm not sure if there's a way in the polarized environment to do it effectively where the counties and the current legislative leadership aren't going to disagree on it. I don't know, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not sure that changing the process on its own does anything to change the real issue, which is, we have this sort of, we've got polarization, now within the logistics of election. All of you, I'm sure, are aware of that. And that is, that's a very significant problem. I don't really understand how the legislation would address the core problem. And we have we now have a new Attorney General, a new Secretary of State, and a new governor who, in theory, I would think would be in a position to agree on more things, and they'll continue. And we obviously also have, a number of new county recorders and different county recorders over time. So it's a long way of saying we haven't signed in or anything to oppose it, but on a gut level, if we just are continuing to have polarizations around what are really, at the end of the day, these are logistical questions, right? I mean, this is part of the debate about what in the sort of this cancerous kind of obsession that folks have with that, elections are not secure is all within these logistical issues that are really hard. Once that gets polarized, it's going to take us a long time to claw our way out of that. Even if tomorrow, former President Trump stopped talking and stopped, lying about how elections went, still is going to take some time for us to work through that system and get that out of the logistics, because, how you can polarize yourselves around something. This is like polarizing, whether or not DHL and FedEx distribution systems are ideologically better. and so, it's like now what we do see our role as is we do think this is more important than ever. in a polarized environment. If we can continue to build our voter education capacity, we have a voter education director, whose name is Gina Roberts, who's a wonderful person. You should, if you ever get a chance to meet her, have her speak to any other organization or this one. She's, great. We have our voter education manager is a man named Avery Zola, also very available out in the community. If we can provide nonpartisan information on how elections actually operate, and we have one advantage then to Maricopa County, Yuma County, other counties don't have, is we don't have to count and defend and also educate, right? We can be outside of that process and provide information, hopefully objectively, but not necessarily be seen as combatants in this very strange online, struggle over, the latest conspiracy theory.
Well, on that note, which is a great note of hope, and we can certainly pray for that. Well, thanks so much for coming today, Tom. Everyone has really enjoyed the questions. You took every question on, you answered it. Let's hear it for Tom. Great talk.
Excellent job, Tom. Thank you for your insight, that great history lesson of the legal history of clean elections, and your wise insight. Really appreciate it. Excellent program.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
If you want to put your contact information in
Sure.
the chat, that would really be good.
Yeah.
I know there was a couple of questions that came in, and so I'm sure Tom would help you with them if you shoot him an email.